HOA stole my land for their luxury retreat, but my trap worked perfectly. The paper's edge sliced across my finger, a stinging prelude to the icy dread that seized me as I read the HOA's decree. My blood ran cold. After review of community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property. 3 generations of my family's legacy were reduced to a bureaucratic sentence. My hands trembled, the letter a venomous viper in my grasp. This wasn't a mistake. It was a declaration of war. I stormed toward Priscilla Winter's pristine residence, the manicured perfection of her lawn a stark insult. Priscilla, our HOA president, answered the door, clad in expensive workout gear, a flicker of annoyance barely concealed beneath her practiced smile. "Ethan, can I help you? This letter, about my land. There's been some mistake." I choked out, desperately trying to maintain a facade of composure. Priscilla's smile remained fixed, but her eyes were glacial. "No mistake. Our professional survey indicates your grandfather's hand-drawn maps were inaccurate. The board voted unanimously last night." The words hit like a physical blow. "Without telling me? I paid taxes on that land for 15 years. She examined her flawless nails, utterly indifferent. "The HOA bylaws don't require notification for property corrections. We're planning a wonderful resort-style pool. Everyone will benefit, even you." The casual cruelty in her voice was a knife twist. As I sputtered in protest, thumping, bass-heavy music erupted from the Morgan's yard next door. Priscilla's face lit up, a genuine, predatory smile blooming. "I should go. Jasper and Samantha are hosting the neighborhood welcome party. You should come, it might help you adjust to the changes." The music throbbed, a mocking soundtrack to my despair as I walked home. Through the fence, I saw my neighbors, Jasper and Samantha, laughing and splashing in their brand new pool, suspiciously close to my property line. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Sleep offered no escape that night. The relentless bass vibrated through the walls until 1 a.m. I tried calling Jasper twice, each ring amplifying my frustration. At 1:15 a.m., I hammered on their door. Jasper, bleary-eyed and reeking of beer, answered. "Hey man, the party's over. What's up? It's almost 1:30. Samantha materialized behind him, her smile tight. "We stopped the music right at 1. Check the bylaws. Noise is still low." Jasper cut me off, his voice laced with arrogance. "Priscilla said we're good until 1. Not our problem if you can hear people talking." I inhaled deeply, fighting to control my rage. "Speaking of Priscilla, did you know about the HOA plan for my back acre?" Their guilty glances were all the confirmation I needed. "You did. You knew they were stealing my land." "Not stealing," Samantha corrected, her voice sharp. "Reallocating. The resort will have a lap pool for serious swimmers, cabanas, a cocktail bar." Jasper shrugged, utterly unrepentant. "It's not personal. Priscilla showed us the real property lines. Your grandfather's maps were wrong." Back in my silent, aching house, I unearthed Grandpa's old wooden chest from the attic. Inside, the original property documents, yellowed and brittle with age, lay like forgotten secrets. I spread them on the kitchen table, the harsh lamp illuminating the stark contrast between Grandpa's meticulous records and Priscilla's sterile survey. Something was fundamentally wrong. Grandpa's boundaries followed the natural contours of the land, the creek, the ancient oak, and the rocky ridge. The HOA map ignored these entirely, drawing ruthless, straight lines that conveniently carved away my most valuable acre. A minuscule note in the corner of Grandpa's deed, a detail I'd always overlooked, caught my eye. It referenced county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed, a plan, dangerous and exhilarating, began to form in my mind. I needed help. At 3 a.m., I scrolled through my contacts and texted Percival Sterling, a surveyor who'd worked with my father years ago. Hope, fragile but insistent, flickered in my chest. The next morning, feigning illness, I drove to the county records office. My cousin, Vince, worked there, and I needed access to the original surveys. "These HOA people," Vince muttered, his voice simmering with resentment as we sifted through dusty files. "They're getting bolder every year. Here it is." The 1952 survey depicted my property extending far beyond even my understanding. The creek had shifted course after a flood in the 70s, but property lines didn't move with water. My phone buzzed. "Community announcement, groundbreaking for Pine Crest Resort begins Tuesday. Please clear any personal items from the designated area." Priscilla. Tuesday. That gave me 5 days. On the drive home, I passed the Morgan's house. Workers were setting up even larger speakers by their pool. Jasper waved cheerfully as I drove past, his oblivious smile fueling my resolve. That afternoon, Sterling arrived, his weathered face a mask of concentration. "Let's find those original markers," he said, his voice low and determined. "If they're still there, the HOA is in deep trouble." We worked until sunset, hidden behind my shed, under years of overgrown weeds. The metallic screech of Sterling's detector filled the air, each sweep's a prayer. Finally, a piercing beep. He dug, his face grim. He held up a corroded metal stake. "According to this," he said, his eyebrows shooting up, "your property extends another 50 feet that way. That includes part of the Morgan's new pool." We found 3 more markers before dark, each confirming Grandpa's maps. My land was larger than I'd thought. "There's more," Sterling said quietly, pointing to a ridge. "The geological survey from the 50s notes this as a potential archaeological site. Native American artifacts were found here in the 40s. Grandpa's stories, arrowheads and pottery shards. I dismissed them as tall tales. What does that mean legally? If confirmed, it could trigger a historical preservation review. No development allowed." That night, another party raged next door. But this time, I smiled, a grim satisfaction tightening my lips. Let them enjoy it while they can. The doorbell rang around 8 p.m. Rose Thompson, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street, stood there with a casserole, her eyes filled with concern. "Thought you might need some dinner with all that commotion next door." I invited her in, the scent of her cooking a comforting balm to my frayed nerves. Soon, I was pouring out the whole story, the injustice of it all. Rose listened intently, her gaze sharp and knowing. "Priscilla's been pulling these tricks for years. She forced the Hendersons out last summer with fake violations. Their house is now her daughter's. Why doesn't anyone stop her? Fear. She's friends with the mayor's wife." But then, her eyes twinkled. "I taught high school history for 40 years and volunteered at the county museum. I know a thing or two about archaeological preservation." As Rose left, she paused at the door, her voice softening. "This land means something to you, doesn't it? Beyond just property value." I thought of Grandpa teaching me to fish in the creek, Dad building my treehouse on the old oak. "It's my history." "Then fight for it," she said simply, her words a shot of adrenaline. In bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meeting tomorrow, 7 a.m. Priscilla's house. Bringing contractors to mark pool placement on your acre. Don't tell Ethan." A misdirected message, a golden opportunity. They weren't waiting until Tuesday. Fury, cold and focused, surged through me. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I needed to be ready. Before sunrise, fueled by black coffee, I prepared. Sterling arrived in an unmarked truck, equipment hidden under tarps. "If we're right about those markers," he whispered as we worked in the pre-dawn gloom, "the HOA survey missed nearly 2 acres of your land." Dew soaked my jeans as we hammered in flags, each strike resonating with righteous anger, marking the precise boundaries of Grandpa's deed. The last marker went directly through the corner of Jasper and Samantha's fancy new deck. "They built that deck last month," I told Sterling, my voice tight with suspicion. "Convenient timing." "Not just convenient," he replied, checking his GPS device. "According to county permits, they built it after the HOA's new survey. Almost like they knew where the new boundary would be." He handed me his tablet, displaying the official report. The HOA's survey completely ignored the creek's original path before the 1978 flood. No professional would make that mistake, accidentally. As the sun crested the horizon, we heard vehicles approaching. "Hide the equipment," I hissed. "Let's see what they do." From behind my garden shed, we watched Priscilla arrive with 3 other board members and a landscaping crew. They unloaded spray paint and measuring tools, laughing as they marked out locations for cabanas, a tiki bar, and a massive pool, all on my property. "This spa feature will be perfect right here," Priscilla said, marking a big X through my grandmother's rose garden, a garden I'd meticulously maintained for 20 years. I wanted to explode, to tear into them, but Sterling held me back. "Not yet. We need more." Later that morning, I visited the local historical society, where my mom had volunteered. The director, Evelyn, greeted me warmly. "Your timing is interesting," she said, pulling out a folder. Someone from the county just requested all records about your property. Priscilla Winters? Evelyn nodded, her expression darkening. She seemed very interested in whether any historical claims had ever been filed. This happened in Meadowbrook, too. Their HOA president works for the same development company as Priscilla. She pulled out a newspaper article. They turned half the neighborhood into vacation rentals after forcing original owners out. Now, the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about a community pool. It was about property values, development deals, and ruthless ambition. I need proof of the archaeological significance, I said, my voice urgent. Evelyn smiled, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Your grandfather donated some artifacts he found on your land. She brought out a small box containing arrowheads and pottery fragments. These were catalogued, but never fully examined. I could arrange for an expert assessment. Back home, I found Rose in her garden across the street. They're marking up my land right now, I told her, my voice tight with suppressed rage. I know, she said calmly. I've been taking pictures every hour. She showed me her phone. Documentation is key. That afternoon, I called Vince again. I need two things: the emergency historical preservation filing process and any information on Priscilla Winter's business connections. While awaiting Vince's call, I noticed Jasper watching me from his yard. Hey, neighbor, he called too cheerfully. Excited about the new resort? I walked to the fence, my gaze unwavering. Why did you build your deck after the HOA survey but before announcing the boundary changes? His smile faltered. The permit for your deck was filed one day after Priscilla's survey. Interesting coincidence. Look, we're just following the official property lines, he stuttered, avoiding my eyes. The official lines include those 1952 markers I found this morning. One's right under your hot tub. Jasper's face strained of color. He muttered something about needing to make a call and hurried inside. Within minutes, my phone rang. Ethan? Priscilla's voice was honey-sweet, but the venom underneath was unmistakable. I hear you have concerns about the community project. Why don't you stop by and we can discuss them? I'd rather talk with everyone present. How about a special HOA meeting? That's not necessary. This is already decided. Then so is my next step, I replied, my voice hardening. Are you threatening me? Just following proper procedures, like documenting the original boundary markers your survey somehow missed. Silence. Then a whispered, What markers? The ones from 1952. Sterling found them this morning. I could almost hear her mind racing. Those old things, they're not relevant to modern surveys. The county assessor's office disagrees. I just spoke with them. Another pause. We'll discuss this tomorrow. Meanwhile, stay off the common areas. You mean my property? I'll be using all of it, thanks. I hung up, feeling stronger than I had in weeks. Vince called back immediately. You hit a nerve, he said. Priscilla just requested emergency access to all your property records too. Too late for her. I've already flagged your parcel with a preliminary historical review notice. Nothing can be developed while that's pending. That evening, I invited Rose and Sterling over to plan our next steps. We spread maps across my kitchen table, the stakes higher than ever. Suddenly, headlights swept across the windows, blinding us. Someone's here, Rose said, peering through the curtains. It's Priscilla and the Morgans. Before I could react, my phone pinged with messages from neighbors. Are you okay? Saw Priscilla heading to your place with the sheriff. Jasper's telling everyone you threatened him. Sterling looked grim. They're escalating. Trying to intimidate you. Let them try, I said, gathering our evidence into a folder. The doorbell rang, followed by aggressive knocking. I opened it to find Priscilla, Jasper, Samantha, and a man in uniform. Evening, folks, I said calmly. What brings you all here so late? Priscilla stepped forward, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Ethan, this is Deputy Wilson. We're concerned about your erratic behavior today. Jasper nodded vigorously. You threatened me in front of my family. My mouth fell open. That's completely false. Deputy Wilson looked uncomfortable. Sir, I understand there's a property dispute, but threatening neighbors. I never threatened anyone. I interrupted. I have witnesses to our conversation. I pointed to Rose's house, where her security camera faced my yard. The deputy's expression changed. Is that so? Priscilla cut in smoothly. This isn't just about today. We're concerned about Ethan's mental state. He's making wild claims about property lines that were settled years ago. I laughed, despite myself. Settled? You just resurveyed them last month. Samantha spoke up, her voice dripping with malice. He's been obsessed with boundaries since we moved in. Always watching us, complaining about the noise. Because you built on my property and party until 1 a.m. I countered. The deputy raised his hands. Okay, slow down, everyone. This sounds like a civil matter, not criminal. Priscilla wasn't giving up. He's been digging up the community land without permission, destroying landscaping. You mean my land? I opened the folder and handed the deputy copies of Sterling's survey report, the original deed, and photos of the 1952 markers. These documents prove the HOA's survey is incorrect. They're trying to take nearly 2 acres of my legal property. The deputy reviewed the papers while Priscilla fumed silently. Ma'am, he finally said, this appears to be a legitimate property dispute that needs to be handled through proper channels, not police intervention. He handed the papers back to me. Unless there's evidence of actual threats or trespassing, I can't take action here. I suggest both parties contact their attorneys. As they turned to leave, I called out. Priscilla, one more thing. You might want to tell your friends at Lakeside Development that the county has initiated a historical preservation review of my property, effective immediately. Priscilla froze, then spun around, her face contorted with rage. How did you know about? She caught herself, but it was too late. The deputy looked between us, clearly sensing there was more to the story. Have a good night, I said pleasantly, closing my door on Priscilla's shocked face. Inside, Rose, Sterling, and I exchanged looks of triumph. But we knew this was just the beginning. They'll come back with lawyers next, Sterling warned. Let them, I replied, tapping the folder. We have truth on our side. Rose smiled slightly. And tomorrow, we'll have even more. I've arranged for an archaeologist friend to examine those artifacts Evelyn found. My phone buzzed with a text from Vince. Found the connection. Priscilla's husband is CFO at Lakeside Development. They just filed plans for vacation rentals in your neighborhood. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about a resort pool. They wanted my land as part of a larger commercial development. We need to warn the neighbors, I said, my voice urgent. Already happening, Rose replied, showing me her phone, where a neighborhood chat group was exploding with messages about Priscilla's development connections. A final text arrived from an unknown number. HOA emergency meeting called for 7 a.m. tomorrow. All board members required. Sterling laughed. Looks like someone's panicking. I should have felt relieved, but something bothered me. They weren't giving up this easily. Priscilla had too much invested. As if summoned by my words, the lights across my backyard suddenly blazed on. Massive construction lights, mounted on the Morgans' property, aimed directly at my house. The glare was blinding, pouring through every window. What the? Sterling started. Rose peered through the brightness, her voice trembling. There's someone out there, by your shed. Squinting against the light, I could just make out figures moving on my property. They were removing my boundary flags. The battle had truly begun. The rumble of heavy machinery jolted me awake at 4:30 a.m. I scrambled to my window and spotted a massive yellow bulldozer creeping toward my back acre. Adrenaline coursed through my veins. I grabbed my phone, deed papers, and a flashlight before racing outside in my slippers, a primal scream building in my throat. Stop right now! I shouted, waving my flashlight wildly. The bulldozer headlights blinded me as it continued forward, its metal blade gleaming ominously in the pre-dawn darkness. The operator, a beefy man in a hard hat, finally cut the engine. Look, buddy, I'm just following orders. Got paperwork right here saying this is HOA property. Well, your paperwork is wrong, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. Grandpa's warnings about vigilance over our property lines echoed in my mind. Headlights swept across my yard as 3 vehicles pulled up. Priscilla stepped out of her white Range Rover, wearing a tailored pantsuit despite the early hour, her face a mask of cold fury. The Morgans followed, and 2 men I didn't recognize, carrying briefcases, completed the tableau. Mr. Thorne, Priscilla called out, her smile tight and brittle. I see you're an early riser too. Wonderful. You can watch the groundbreaking ceremony. I held up my phone, my finger hovering over the call button. I've already called Sheriff Davis, He's on his way. You're trespassing on private property. Actually, Priscilla replied, unfolding a document from her leather portfolio. According to the county survey we commissioned, this land falls within community boundaries. We're being quite generous with the compensation package. Jasper Morgan snickered behind her. Time to join the team, Thorne. The resort will boost all our property values. I stood my ground, feeling the damp grass between my toes, my voice ringing with defiance. I filed an emergency injunction yesterday. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I have the original survey markers to prove it. Priscilla's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly. An injunction? How inconvenient. She turned to one of the suited men. Humphrey, call Judge Watkins. Wake him if necessary. The distant wail of a police siren cut through the tension. Sheriff Davis, my father's old fishing buddy, pulled up in his patrol car, looking irritated. What's going on here? He asked, adjusting his belt as he approached. Priscilla stepped forward, hand outstretched, her voice dripping with insincerity. Good morning, Sheriff. Small misunderstanding about property lines. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. I echoed, my voice rising. They're trying to steal my land. Sheriff Davis looked between us, his gaze shrewd. Ma'am, do you have permits for this machinery to operate before 7 a.m.? And construction permits for whatever you're planning? Priscilla's smile faltered. We have HOA authorization. That's not what I asked. Sheriff Davis interrupted, his voice firm. County ordinance says no construction before 7 a.m. in residential areas, and I don't see any permits displayed. While they argued, I noticed Rose, my 78-year-old neighbor, walking toward us with a stack of yellowed papers. She had been on the original HOA board 30 years ago, before retiring. Priscilla, Rose called out, her voice stronger than her frail frame suggested. You might want to see these before you make a terrible mistake. Priscilla dismissed her with a wave. Not now, Rose. Rose ignored her, handing me the papers instead. Your grandfather and I prepared for something like this years ago. The HOA tried the same tactic in '89 with the Henderson property. I skimmed the documents, original meeting minutes showing the true boundaries had been officially recorded with the state, not just the county. Sheriff, I said, my voice steady, I'd like to file harassment charges, and I want these people and their equipment off my property immediately. Priscilla's phone buzzed. She stepped away to answer it, her face darkening as she listened. When she returned, her voice had lost its edge, replaced by a brittle resignation. There appears to be a paperwork conflict, she announced to her group. We'll postpone today's work to sort out these technicalities. The bulldozer operator looked relieved as he climbed down from his machine. So, no work today? Pack it up. Priscilla snapped, her voice laced with barely suppressed fury, as they reluctantly retreated. I noticed several neighbors had gathered at the edge of my property, watching the scene unfold, some recording everything on their phones. Priscilla noticed too. Her eyes narrowed as she walked to her car. This isn't over, Thorne. The board votes tomorrow on invoking our emergency powers clause. I suggest you prepare a reasonable counteroffer before then. Sheriff Davis waited until they drove away before turning to me, his face etched with concern. Your dad always said the HOA would try something like this after he passed. You holding up okay? I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of fighting this battle alone. I'll be fine. But I need to prepare for tomorrow. Rose patted my arm. You're not alone, dear. Some of us remember how this community started before people like Priscilla tried to turn it into their personal country club. As we stood in my yard, watching the sunrise paint the sky with hope, my phone dinged with a text from Sterling. Found something big in the county archives. Meet me at 9 a.m. Bring coffee. Lots of it. I looked up at my neighbors, still lingering at the edge of my property. Some gave encouraging waves, while others turned away awkwardly. The battle lines were being drawn, and tomorrow's vote would test exactly who stood where. You can't go in there. Priscilla's assistant tried to block my path as I pushed through the double doors of Ridge Community Center. The emergency HOA meeting had started 20 minutes early. Another of Priscilla's tricks. I can't, I replied, clutching my leather briefcase. Inside were the fruits of my all-night research session with Sterling, documents that would change everything. Heads turned as I marched down the center aisle, the room packed with over 100 neighbors. Some I'd known for decades, others recent arrivals, drawn by Priscilla's promises of a resort-style community upgrade. Priscilla stood at the podium mid-sentence, her crimson lipstick matching her blazer, her voice sharp and confident. As I was saying before the interruption, the vote to invoke our Community Enhancement Clause requires a 2/3 majority. Before anyone votes, I announced loudly, my voice ringing through the room. You should know what you're voting on. Priscilla's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the microphone. Mr. Thorne, you're out of order. We're following Robert's rules here. Funny you mention rules, I said, opening my briefcase, the leather hinges snapping like a gunshot. Because I've spent the night discovering just how many you've broken. Whispers rippled through the crowd. I spotted the Morgans in the front row, Jasper nervously adjusting his collar. 3 rows back, Rose gave me an encouraging nod, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. Point of order, called Humphrey, Priscilla's lawyer friend. The agenda doesn't allow for. The agenda was changed without proper notice. I countered, my voice unwavering. Section 5 of your bylaws requires 72 hours notice for emergency meeting notifications, with no changes permitted after distribution. Humphrey's mouth snapped shut as several neighbors murmured in agreement. I approached the front table where the board sat, placing my briefcase with deliberate force. I request 10 minutes to present relevant information before any vote occurs. Board member Irina Chun, who'd always been fair despite her friendship with Priscilla, spoke up. I move we allow Mr. Thorne to speak. Seconded, called several voices, their support bolstering my resolve. Priscilla's face tightened, a visible crack in her composure, but she stepped aside. Very well. 10 minutes. I laid out 3 large maps on the presentation table. This first document is the original 1952 survey of Maple Ridge, showing the natural creek boundary that defined my family's property. I pointed to the winding blue line. The creek formed a natural border between private and community land, a border recognized and respected for decades. But during the flood of '78, the creek shifted. Priscilla interrupted, her voice dismissive. Ancient history. Our recent survey. I emphasized the word. Your survey conveniently ignores the original boundary markers, which state law maintains as the legal definition, even when natural features change. I unveiled Sterling's new certified survey, the red boundary line starkly contrasting with Priscilla's, extending far beyond what the HOA claimed. According to state law and county records, my property includes all of this area, which, unfortunately for some of you, includes land you thought was yours. Gasps erupted as neighbors recognized the implications. That's impossible! Jasper Morgan sputtered, his face paling. Unfortunately not, I replied, my voice hard, but controlled. Your swimming pool extends 12 feet onto my legal property. I paused for effect. And Priscilla's home addition from last spring, it's 18 feet over the line. All eyes turned to Priscilla, whose composed facade cracked for the first time, her carefully constructed image crumbling before the community. This is absurd, she cried, her voice shrill. Our survey was conducted by your brother-in-law's company. I finished for her, my voice dripping with disdain. A clear conflict of interest, which I've outlined in this ethics complaint filed with the state licensing board this morning. I handed copies to each board member. But there's something even more significant. With deliberate movements, I removed a plastic bag from my briefcase. Inside, carefully arranged, were what looked like stone arrowheads. During our legitimate survey yesterday, we discovered these artifacts, which the county archaeologist has preliminarily identified as dating back approximately 800 years. The room went completely silent, the import of my words hanging heavy in the air. I've already filed for historical preservation status, I explained, my voice echoing in the silence. Which means no development can occur within 200 feet of the discovery site, effectively covering my entire property. Rose stood from her seat, her posture ramrod straight, walking slowly to the front of the room. I was there when these were uncovered, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. As an amateur archaeologist, I recognized their significance immediately. Priscilla's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. She shoved him away, her eyes blazing with desperation. This is a delay tactic, she hissed. We have investors waiting. Contracts signed. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Irina Chun leaned forward, her expression grim. What investors, Priscilla? The board hasn't approved any contracts. Priscilla's mistake registered on her face, too late to retract. The room erupted in questions, accusations, and cries of outrage. Order! Order! Priscilla shouted, banging her gavel so hard the head broke off, a symbolic end to her reign. I wasn't finished, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. While researching property records, I discovered something else interesting. I held up a document with highlighted sections, letting the damning information speak for itself. 3 months ago, Priscilla and her husband created an LLC called Ridgeline Development Partners. 2 weeks later, this LLC purchased the vacant lot next to my property, which would significantly increase in value if a resort facility were built adjacent to it. Board member Frank Thompson's eyes widened, a dawning comprehension spreading across his face. You told us you sold that property to your cousin. This is character assassination. Priscilla snarled, her composure completely shattered. No, I replied calmly, my gaze unwavering. It's public record. I gestured to the horrified faces around the room. Irina Chun stood up, her face pale but resolute. I move we adjourn this meeting and suspend all actions regarding the proposed development until a full investigation of these allegations can be completed. Seconded, called several voices, a chorus of indignation. You can't do this. Priscilla's voice rose dangerously, a desperate plea. We have deadlines. What deadlines? Asked Frank, his voice dripping with suspicion. And what contracts are you talking about? As the board members turned on each other, a feeding frenzy of accusations and recriminations, I noticed Jasper Morgan slipping out a side door, phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of panic. Priscilla saw me watching him leave, and something cold and malevolent entered her eyes. This isn't over, Thorne, she hissed. Not by a long shot. Irina approached me as the meeting dissolved into chaos, her face etched with concern. You should know that Priscilla's been talking to city officials about rezoning this entire area. Whatever game she's playing, it's bigger than just your property. I nodded, suddenly understanding why Priscilla had been so aggressive, so determined. Thank you for the warning. As neighbors crowded around me with questions, congratulating me, my phone vibrated with a text from Sterling. Don't celebrate yet. Found building permits filed under a different company name. They're going after Rose's property next. Meet me at the county office ASAP. I looked across the room where Priscilla huddled with Humphrey and 2 remaining loyal board members. Despite the setback, she wore a slight smile, a glint of defiance in her eyes. Whatever she had planned, I realized this battle was far from over. Get off my property! I shouted as Priscilla's fancy car pulled into my driveway, kicking up gravel. The entire HOA board spilled out, a swarm of angry hornets from a disturbed nest. My heart pounded, a drumbeat of anticipation and fear, but I planted my feet firmly on my porch steps, my resolve solid. We need to talk, Priscilla said, her voice icier than winter, her words clipped and precise. She clutched a leather folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. Behind her stood a nervous man in an expensive suit, who kept checking his watch, his unease palpable. Mr. Everly, HOA Legal Counsel, he mumbled, barely looking at me, his voice apologetic. I crossed my arms, a silent declaration of defiance. Funny. I was about to call my lawyer too. And the county assessor. And maybe the local news station. Priscilla's face twitched, a flicker of rage barely suppressed. The other board members exchanged worried glances, their initial aggression faltering under my unwavering gaze. Perhaps we could discuss this inside? Everly suggested, his voice cracking slightly, his gaze darting nervously around the neighborhood. I shook my head, a cold smile playing on my lips. We can talk right here, where the neighbors can see us. I'm done with secret meetings and backroom deals. Mrs. Garcia from next door happened to be watering her flowers, clearly eavesdropping, her eyes wide with curiosity. Rose had positioned her lawn chair on her front porch with a clear view of my yard, her face unreadable. Even old Mr. Jenkins had his window open, his hearing aid turned up high, not wanting to miss a single word. Everly cleared his throat, a nervous tick in his jaw. We've reviewed your documentation. The board is prepared to make a reasonable offer. Which is? I asked, raising an eyebrow, my voice dripping with sarcasm. We drop all claims to your property, Priscilla said through clenched teeth, her voice strained and unnatural. In exchange, you waive any claims against the structures currently on your land. I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the still air. You mean your legal home addition and the Morgan's pool that crosses my property line by 8 feet? That's your big offer? It's more than fair, board member Keith insisted, his face reddening with anger. What about the bulldozer that nearly destroyed my garden? The noise violations? The threats? The lies to the community about my land? Everly stepped forward, lowering his voice, his eyes pleading. Be reasonable, Mr. Thorne. We could tie this up in court for years. You could try, I replied, pulling out my phone, my finger hovering over the record button. But I recorded Priscilla giving orders to start construction before the approved date, and I have statements from 3 contractors saying they were told to ignore property markers. Priscilla lunged forward, her eyes blazing with unadulterated fury. You can't prove. And I have copies of the emails where you discussed how to pressure me into selling. I continued, watching her face pale with satisfaction. My cousin in county records found those quite interesting. Did you know improperly filed HOA documents become public record after 7 years? The tension in the air felt thick enough to cut. Everly whispered urgently to Priscilla, his voice barely audible. Priscilla's perfectly styled hair seemed to droop with each passing second, the picture of defeat. What do you want? She finally asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, the defeat creeping into her eyes, replacing the fire with a cold, hollow resignation. I'd been waiting for this question, savoring the moment. First, a binding agreement with severe penalties if broken, that the leisure center gets built on the actual common land by the front entrance, where it belongs. Priscilla visibly recoiled. Impossible! It's not. I raised my hand, cutting her off. Second, revised noise rules with real enforcement, a system that works to maintain peace and tranquility in our neighborhood. Her face contorted with rage, but she remained silent, her eyes narrowed into slits. Third, I continued, my voice ringing with righteous purpose. You make a public apology at the next meeting, acknowledging your wrongdoing and the harm you've caused to me and this community. Jasper, who had been hovering behind the group, his face a mask of suppressed anger, pushed forward, his voice rising in protest. That's ridiculous. You can't make demands like